Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 1 Lecture. So hopefully by now everyone's had a chance to watch the introductory lecture that I sent back on Sunday night. Now that we've had a chance to check out the Week 1 module, look over the syllabus, watch my introduction, it's time for us to really get into our first week's content, our actual material, our first lesson of the semester. And I want to start with reading. Now, this might seem a little elementary or a little unnecessary to some of us. After all, we can all read, so you might be wondering why we need to talk about this. But reading is one thing. We all read. We read every day. Even if we don't like to read for pleasure, we still have to read. You read text messages, you read emails, you read street signs, you read instructions, you're on websites. It's impossible to go very long without reading. But a lot of the stuff that we have to read on a day-to-day basis is pretty simple, it's pretty short, it's pretty easy to understand. So oftentimes we read passively. And that's no crime, really, but what it means is you're reading something, but your attention is not exclusively on the thing that you're reading. I think we can all relate to this. Just imagine for a moment that I am you, and I am reading something, maybe for school. And yeah, I'm reading it. Here's the book, okay, I'm reading, sure, but I'm also listening to music. I'm also periodically checking my phone. You can see my phone here, and I'm exchanging text messages or whatever with friends. And then maybe every once in a while, I'm gonna check out, some kind of social media thing, or I'm gonna check my email, visit a website, do something else online. So this is passive reading, and this is how too many students approach reading. Yeah, I'm going to do it, but I'm also going to talk to friends, listen to music, and maybe surf the internet while I do it. And that's not a very effective approach. Now, it might work fine for some of your everyday writing tasks, the simple stuff. You can read a text message while also, listening to the television. That's no big deal. But when you're reading assignments for school, you have to shift gears and you have to move away from passive reading, and you need to become a more active reader. So that means put the headphones away, try to stay away from your phone for maybe a half an hour or somewhere in that neighborhood. Don't have other windows open on your computer. And perhaps most importantly, read with a pen in hand. Now, this is something that does not come naturally to us. A lot of times we want to read fast. We want to kind of hurry up and get through the assignment so we can do something fun. The downside to that is if you read passively, if you read in sort of a sloppy, distracted manner, the problem is you're not going to remember what you read. You're not going to be able to do anything with the material that you just read. You're not going to be able to use those concepts or that information for any real practical purpose. You're not going to be able to make use of it or remember it or talk intelligently about it. So that begs the question, why bother even reading it in the first place? So again, I can't control how you guys read. All I can do is encourage you to adopt certain strategies and techniques. So that's what I want to start by talking about today. So when you're reading anything from 50 essays throughout the rest of the semester, and remember, I won't get into this because it's in the email I sent you earlier, but you can use the 5th edition or the 6th edition of 50 essays. There was some bookstore confusion. It was mostly my fault, but they ordered the 6th edition, not the 5th. If you already have the 5th, that's fine, but the 6th is also fine. They're pretty similar. So no matter which edition you have, and no matter what you're reading, I want you to read with a pen in hand, and I want your concentration, your focus, to be exclusively on the text. So I have 3 really easy, sort of basic strategies that I would like you guys to write down and use when you're reading for this class. And again, they're very easy. Some of you might already do some of this stuff. But if you don't already do them, try them on for size. And at least some technique wrapped up in one of these three big ideas should help you in some way or another. You should be able to see it paying off for you down the line. So I want you to write these down. In the future, I should be able to project some visuals. I'm not quite equipped to do that right now. I'm just filming this at home, and I don't yet have the setup quite where I want it. So pretty easy note-taking today, though. You guys can write this down as I go. And also, a lot of this stuff is in the Week 1 module, in the overview. So I talk a lot in the overview about annotation. And you also see that concept discussed in the introductory chapter to 50 essays. So we'll get to that in a moment, but I want to start with something even easier, and that is underlining or circling. So when you're reading, anything that makes an impression on you, any word, phrase, idea, or claim, or a point that the author is making, anything that really makes an impression on you or seems interesting to you or seems like something that you might like to learn more about, or on the flip side, if it's confusing to you or if you don't quite get it or if you're not sure what you're supposed to do with it, anything that seems important, anything that you might want to return to, underline it. Or you can circle it, or you can put stuff in brackets. But basically, this is a way of highlighting. This is a way of calling attention to some of the most important words, sentences, or ideas in the text that you're reading. And this is going to help you on multiple levels. On one hand, it will help you to better understand what you're reading, because underlining and annotating, which we're about to discuss, these things make you slow down. These activities make you read a little more slowly and thoroughly, because you're stopping and you're making marks with your pen. So you're not just flying through it. So slowing down is good. That will improve comprehension, but also you're helping yourself down the road. Because when you underline or circle or put stuff in brackets, you're basically giving yourself kind of a cheat sheet or kind of a study guide when you need to return to that text. If you need to go back to it at some future date. Maybe you're writing about it. Maybe you're using it in one of your major essays. So when you want to go back, you can find quickly all the most important stuff in that text because you've already highlighted it. So it's just a way to kind of go back and find the most important details, the most important info, or maybe the sentences or words that you like the best. Maybe you might want to quote some of them in the future in some of your own work. So obviously you don't want to underline everything. That's pointless. You want to underline the most important things. So main ideas, topic sentences. If you think you can identify the author's thesis, if it seems pretty clearly stated, you might want to underline that. Any helpful examples. But I also just underline stuff that I like. If I find a phrase that really strikes me and I say, oh, that's good. Like, that sounds good. That sounds really interesting. I'll underline that because I might want to come back and do something with it later. So this is an easy way to become a more active reader because, again, replace the headphones and the phone and the internet with a pen, and you should notice some results. So that's underlining, and that's pretty easy to understand. And again, you can do it however you want. You can actually underline. That I just use a pen like this. I underline, I circle. I also put stuff in brackets sometimes if it's going to be a longer block of text. But you can also use a highlighter, an actual highlighter marker, and just, find the stuff that's most important to you. Let's move on to annotation. The book talks about it. I want to give you a really easy definition to keep in mind. When you annotate, that simply means that you are taking notes while you read. You're taking notes in the middle of the reading process. So a lot of times we think about taking notes as something that we do during class, or maybe if we're studying at home or something. But I want you to start taking notes while you read. And I want to try to show you an example of a book that not that this book matters to you, but this is something that I had to read as a graduate student. And I guess I just want to prove that annotation really does work and that underlining really is a thing. So professional writers do this. Professional writers, people who have to read a lot and then write about what they read or use what they read to help them later with their writing, which is the life that I lived for many years. I mean, me, other people, we all use these techniques. So if you can see these pages, you'll notice that I've underlined a bunch of stuff, like the last few lines there at the bottom of the page. But I'm also annotating, and you can kind of see what annotations look like. They're just comments. In some cases questions, in other cases they're just sort of observations that I'm making as I'm reading. It's sort of like a running log that I'm keeping in real time. So a lot of this stuff would not make sense to anybody else because annotations are just for you. They're very personal, not like personal like private. They're only there for you. They're there to help you, not really to help anybody else. So just some of the things I've written here. I don't agree with that. Good. Better. I don't understand what that means. And then I've underlined a few words and made some comments about them. So I underlined the word money, and then I said something about this character in the book who I thought was greedy. And then when I get down to the bottom here, when I underline this whole, it's almost a whole paragraph, I write several comments. One of them is nicely done, especially interesting when you consider his backstory. I don't even know what that means anymore. But these are all comments, questions, notes that I'm making as I read. So you can notice, they're sloppy. I'm writing in the margins. That's kind of what we traditionally mean when we say annotate. We kind of have an old school notion of reading stuff in hard copy form with a pen in hand and just writing in the margins. Oh, I like that. What the hell is that? What does he mean? I need to come back to this. This is a key word. This seems to be his argument. Here's an example of what he's talking about at the bottom of the page, going over to the next page. Stuff like that. And the book also, if you look at that introductory chapter in 50 essays, and it's the same in both editions, you can see the sample essay that they're kind of showing you here, just as an example to see what kinds of annotations a student might make when reading something like this. Again, you're seeing the same kinds of comments in the margins. In some cases, questions. In some cases, just things that the student thinks. That's a strong emotion. That echoes the essay's title. Living with rage might make him crazy. And again, none of that makes sense to us because we haven't read this text, right? But they make sense to the student who's making the annotations. Down near the bottom, he's asking a question. He's kind of pushing on some of the ideas, trying to make sure that he understands. So that's all annotation really is. You can write down virtually anything. Questions, comments, little brief summaries of what you just read. You might want to explain certain things that you didn't maybe immediately know, but you hopped on Wikipedia, you Googled it, you figured it out. So you just might want to write in a little explanation of a particular word or idea in the margin, because that's just going to help you later. It's going to help you remember the piece, and it's going to help you to talk about it or write about it. You can jot down definitions. You can jot down, like I said, things that you like. You can sort of draw attention to things that you like or things that you don't like. It's totally up to you. So there's really no rules when it comes to annotation. You're just trying to jot down the things that will help you understand what you're reading and will help you to remember what you're reading. So I will never really ask you to turn in annotations. Again, they're kind of personal. They are mostly there to aid you in your reading process. So I want you guys to get into the habit of writing these kinds of notes as you go. Okay, I'm not sure what he means in this paragraph. I don't agree with that idea. I think what he's trying to say here is blank. And let me just say one more thing about that final example that I offered. Sometimes annotations work well as sort of like translations. Sometimes we're going to read stuff in this class that might be a little difficult or confusing in some ways. And some of the author's language might sound old or weird or just different from the way that we talk and the way that we write. So in some cases, what you're doing with annotations is you're finding sort of difficult to understand sentences or ideas, and you can translate them into your own words. What the author is saying here is he didn't like it. Right? Put it in a simple colloquial phrase that you'll quickly understand and remember. That's what I still do that when I read dense, difficult texts. I put stuff in my own words. So this is effective, and yeah, it does slow you down. A lot of students don't want to write stuff while they're reading because then it takes them longer to finish the reading. But I guarantee you this will help. This will make a difference. This will improve your comprehension and your recall. Because they've done studies, maybe you guys are familiar with some of this. Humans don't have a really strong ability to remember what we read. Even the smartest among us, even those with the best memories. We just don't recall written text very well. We tend to recall personal experiences or things that we sort of learned about visually better and longer than we remember things that we read. So we're kind of fighting an uphill struggle. It's natural to forget what you read. But if you take notes, you don't necessarily have to go back and reread the whole thing. You'll have annotations, you'll have important stuff underlined, and you'll be able to find what you need quickly and efficiently. So hopefully that makes sense. The third general strategy that I just wanted to briefly mention today is asking questions. So underlining / circling / bracket / highlighter is number one. Annotating is number two, and asking questions is number three. So this is, again, informal. You can sort of do this in your own head, or you can jot down a few questions. Oftentimes, some of your annotations, like I said, will take the form of questions. So you might already have a few questions written down, but after you finish reading, you might want to ask a few more. You might want to start a Word doc. You might want to do this by hand in your notebook, or you can just ask yourself some questions sort of in your own mind. But there's sort of two levels, and we'll talk more about the micro and the macro level as we get a little more sophisticated in our techniques. But basically, you want to make sure that you know what the overall point and the overall argument of the piece is. That's the big picture stuff. That's macro. That's big. Okay, what is this about? What does the author want me to know? What does the author want me to think? What's the point of this piece? So you need to make sure you know that. But then there's a lot of micro questions that you might have. At the micro level, you're looking at individual sentences, maybe even individual words. And you might have some questions on the micro level, even though you understand the big picture. You understand the gist of it, but you're not quite sure what the author meant in her third paragraph when she said X, Y, or Z. So you can have small micro questions or big picture questions. What is this about? What is this essay saying? Maybe you're still working on figuring that part out. But by sort of working through some questions yourself, you're going to help. You're just helping yourself. You're giving yourself a chance to arrive at a better understanding. You can start arriving at your own conclusions. But if you can't answer some of those questions, that's not a problem. You don't need to feel bad or embarrassed about that. You can ask me. You can ask a classmate or a friend, but you should maybe ask me. first and foremost. But, and again, even in your discussion posts, if there are certain things about some of these texts that you're not quite sure about, you can pose a question. And you guys can maybe respond to each other on some of these discussion boards and help each other out. And of course, I can also offer any help that you might need. So if you guys can start doing those things, underlining, annotating, and asking questions, I promise you will become more active readers and you'll become more critical readers. So I wanted to talk about this concept a little bit. We find this term in the introductory chapter to 50 essays. And like they say in the book, they don't necessarily mean, to be critical like in a sort of negative way. They just mean sort of three things when they say critical reading. They mean being inquisitive. You guys probably know what that word means. Being inquisitive just means you're asking questions and you're trying to understand. So that's kind of one phase of the critical reading concept. The second phase is being evaluative, evaluating what you read, deciding what the author is saying, and deciding if what the author is doing is successful, worthwhile, effective, whatever. A lot of times students are reluctant to evaluate professional writing, the prose work, because maybe you don't feel qualified to do that, but actually you are. Because as a reader, this is just part of what you do. You have to arrive at your own opinions, your own conclusions about what you read. So that includes evaluation. You have to decide, does this work? Is this good? Does the author accomplish his or her goals? And then finally, when they say critical reading, they want you to think about being a little bit skeptical. And you probably know this word as well. When you're skeptical, you're not automatically accepting everything that the author is saying. It doesn't mean that you have to reject it all, but if you're skeptical, you need to be persuaded perhaps a little bit more. Maybe you're not immediately going along with the argument that's being made. Maybe you don't accept all the ideas that you found in the text that you're reading, and that's okay. You don't have to agree with all of these authors that we're reading in 50 essays. You don't have to think all of their essays are good or true. But you need to be able to explain your position. You need to be able to tell me why it's not effective, why it's not true, why their argument does not work. So when you're skeptical, you might really push back against the author and say, no, I'm not buying it. But more commonly, you'll accept certain things. You might be less sure about other things. But you're thinking for yourself, in other words, right? This is very much like critical thinking. You're asking questions, you're pushing back a little bit on certain preconceived notions or certain traditions, conventions. As readers, you have freedom. You get to decide what you think and how you feel about everything that we read. Doesn't matter what I think, doesn't matter what your classmates think. As long as you understand what you've read and you're arriving at original conclusions based on reason and logic and based on your own observations, based on what you see and what you've been doing, that's great. So being skeptical, being evaluative, and being inquisitive are sort of the hallmarks of critical reading. So again, we don't have a checklist that we have to fill out every time we read a piece from our book. But if you guys can just kind of remember to do some of this stuff, just push back a little bit, ask questions about these authors, and always take notes, always give yourself an opportunity to return to this stuff later, because I will ask you to do that with some of your bigger assignments. For example, the argument that we're writing at the end of the semester will be an argument based on a couple of pieces that you've read in the book. So even if you read something now and you're not returning to it until December, again, if that's the case, think about how important those annotations and those questions will be. They will refresh your memory. They will get you back into that text. They will remind you what was most important about that text. And maybe they even helped you sort of, think more about that text and explore it further over the course of this semester as well. So these are just things that all of us can do, and I want you guys to try some of these strategies. Now, if you look on page 7 of that introductory chapter, this is a really nice checklist that they provide for you on the top of page 7. It's called a checklist for annotating a reading. Just some things that you can take notes about. These are things to look for and take notes on. So the main topic, any sort of supporting or secondary points or topics, obviously the overall main point of the essay that we're reading, any examples, any evidence or support for the argument that you find to be especially, like I said, interesting, compelling, that made an impression on you. And as I've already mentioned, annotate about stuff that you like and stuff that you don't like. And finally, the last line of the checklist is important to remember. Words, people, ideas, or any kind of reference that you're not familiar with. Too many students just kind of shut down when they come across an unfamiliar concept. Oh, I don't know what that means. Oh well, they either move on or they get frustrated and they feel like they're not going to be able to understand the big picture because they don't understand this particular reference or this particular sentence, or they don't know who that person is that's being mentioned or whatever. But we have the internet. You have Google. Almost any word or person or idea that you don't recognize, that you don't understand, that you've never heard before, just punch it into Google, and within seconds, you will probably be able to figure out what it is. And that's especially true of historical events, people. There's probably a Wikipedia page about a lot of that stuff. So if you're not familiar with it right now, that's fine, but get familiar with it. Figure out what that reference is, and again, that's really useful stuff to write in the margins. If you hop on Google, you find a definition, or you figure out who this person is, you don't have to make a big production out of it, just jot it in the margin. And if you're reading your book in electronic form, let me just remind you, you're not off the hook when it comes to annotating, because you can always just take notes on a separate sheet of paper. You might even have some annotation tools built into your reader, depending on what program you're using. For example, with some of the more recent versions of Adobe, if you're reading PDFs, you can annotate them. You can write comments as you go. But even if you can't do that, there's always pen and paper. So as you're reading on the screen, you can be writing in your notebook. All right, so I think that's enough on annotating and underlining and asking questions. Let me talk just a little bit before signing off about the writing process, okay? Again, this is important, and we're going to talk about it throughout the semester, so I'm not going to be able to put a bow on it right now here in the Week 1 lecture, but I hope you guys had a chance to watch the Simpsons clip that I posted to the Week 1 module. You might not be big fans of the Simpsons, but it's a funny clip, and that's the main reason I put it there, and it's about writing. But all comedy aside, I want you to pay attention to some of the problems that Lisa is having as she tries to write this novel or this book that she's working on. You might be reminded of some of your own experiences, because basically she's trying to sit down and write without any kind of planning, without any kind of a structure, without, in other words, following the steps of the writing process. She thinks she can just sit down, hammer it out in a few hours, and she'll be done. And the reason that makes English teachers laugh is because a lot of students think that way. A lot of students are kind of like Lisa, and they're like, oh, I have an essay due tomorrow, but no big deal. I'm just going to sit down at around 9 or 10 o'clock tonight, and I'm just going to write it. I haven't really thought about it. I haven't done anything for it, but it's not due until tomorrow. So, I'm just going to write it tonight. I'll go to bed, and then I'll submit it tomorrow. right? I mean, that's fine. But that's not really fine, at least not at this level. Now, maybe you were able to do that successfully in high school. Maybe that method worked for you previously in school, but it's unlikely that you'll continue to have success with that, at least in my class, because I expect that you guys will follow the steps of the writing process. And right now, as you're taking notes, I just want to give you the three main areas, the three main phases of the writing process that we're going to be following, that we're going to be using throughout the semester. I have to plug my laptop in here. My battery is running low. So we start with pre-writing, everything that comes before the actual writing. So pre as in P-R-E, and then writing. This just means idea generation. This means organization as well. And it's an opportunity to think a little bit about your thesis. So I'll often get you guys started on pre-writing in class. I'll often give you some, idea generation activities to do, well, when I say in class, I mean while I'm lecturing. So while you're watching, or also I'll put some of this in the modules, you'll be able to just, brainstorm, get some ideas down on paper. There's a few strategies that I'm going to introduce once we get started on our first few, big assignments. So we're not going to do this for discussion posts, but for all of our major essays, we're going to start with pre-writing. And we're going to spend some time coming up with ideas. And then the next step is to think about what we're trying to say, what we're trying to accomplish, what's the overall point of our paper, and then we're going to work on outlines. We're going to work on organization. Okay, what is my paper going to look like? What am I going to be talking about in each one of my individual paragraphs? You don't have to have all of that completely figured out, but the outline will be a blueprint. It will be a plan. Think about building a house or any kind of structure. People have plans for those. They have blueprints. They follow the plan. Writing works in a very similar way. The outline is your plan. Sometimes you might deviate a little bit from the plan, but it's good to have a plan. So once you've done all the pre-writing, we move into phase 2, which is drafting. And we know what that means. You actually create a rough draft. But I'm going to expect us to have rough drafts in this class, and towards the end of the semester, we're actually going to exchange those drafts and provide some peer review. We're going to help each other. We're going to offer some feedback. I can also review all rough drafts, any rough draft. Perhaps I should rephrase that. I can review anyone's rough draft who sends it to me. Anybody who takes the time to send me a draft can get feedback on that draft from me. A lot of students don't take me up on that, and this will not be an official thing where you're submitting on Web Campus. You can just email me your rough draft, and I'll get back to you with my thoughts, my corrections, and my overall impression of where you are and what you need to do next. So, again, writing takes time. Writing is difficult, as they allude to in the chapter. It's not something that we can just turn on. So we have to start with pre-writing, we have to produce multiple drafts, and then finally we have post-writing, P-O-S-T writing, everything that comes after the actual writing of the paper. So this means revision and editing, making improvements to our rough draft. Obviously, we're fixing errors, we're making corrections, but we're also improving organization, maybe tightening up our thesis, maybe trimming down an overly long paragraph, maybe adding a sentence here, taking out a sentence there. It's an ongoing process. Writing takes a long time if you want to get to where you want to go. So we'll talk a lot more about this, and I'm going to walk you guys through all of these steps as we start working on some of our bigger projects. But if you go back to that Simpsons clip, again, Lisa's trying to do it all in one night. But compare her experience to the group of people who are actually experiencing success with writing. So Homer and Dr. Frank and Marge's sisters, I can't remember the episode anymore. I don't know what they're writing, but they are working together. So you should notice that. At one point, we see them sitting around the kitchen table. You see them exchanging drafts. That's peer review. At one point, Homer hands Dr. Frank a draft. So they're working together. They're also doing some pre-writing stuff. In one of those scenes, we see some kind of a bulletin board. They're like tacking up notes or ideas up on the board. That's a form of idea generation. That's a good way to get started. And then we kind of see that writer's workshop. Again, we see peer review, but they're going through several steps. Right? We see Homer and the guys at the bar. We see them at the table. We see them working individually and in groups. So you just notice how different what they're doing is from what Lisa is doing, and how much more effective it is to break up the writing into steps, to work together, to produce multiple drafts, to do that early idea generation. And of course, it's not exact, but they are doing a much better job, that group, they're doing a much better job of following the writing process. So again, there's some content about that in the week 1 overview, so check that out. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in the weeks to come as we get started on our narrative. So just make sure you're working on the first discussion post, which is due at the end of this week, and it's asking you to talk a little bit about song lyrics. So this is a good way for us to ease into our reading routine, our attempts to become better readers. Let's tackle a text that we like, that we're familiar with, and hopefully it's pretty easy to work with. That's why I'm asking you to choose a song that you like. It doesn't matter what the song's about, but it needs to be something you like and know. Find the lyrics online, and then I want you to annotate those lyrics. So this works best really if you print the lyrics out, or if you at least need to have them pulled up on your computer screen, and you can take some notes on a separate sheet of paper. But if possible, you can underline some key words. I mean, a lot of words in songs get repeated, and a lot of phrases get repeated in the form of a chorus or something. So you should find some key words, some important ideas, annotate the lyrics, and this might not take long because they might be short. The lyrics might not be very lengthy. Just write down some notes. Make sure you understand everything that's going on in these lyrics, and then you can respond to the questions that I've posed in the discussion post assignment. So this is just a chance for us to get comfortable with reading, annotating, and responding. So it gives us a chance to start with something relatively easy, but we're going to use these same strategies, the same procedure once we start reading stuff that's more difficult. So if we get comfortable now, we will be more comfortable later when the going gets a little tougher. Okay? So if you have any questions, if you're having any issues with Web Campus or the books or anything else, email me, and I will see you next week.